Welcome to our Race, Law, and Social Work event. I'm so glad that you can come today. I'm Elaine Congress. I'm an Associate Dean for Continuing Education and Special Programs and a professor at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service. I also coordinate the Dual Law and Social Work program at GSS. It's really my pleasure to welcome you to this special event. And we're very pleased that our Dean Deborah McPhee, who has been a longtime proponent of promoting an anti-racist agenda in the community and in social work education, has been able to join us today, even though she has two other conflicting meetings at the same time. She's been a dean since 2013, and she's had more than 25 years of experience in academia, in professional social work practice, and also in the private sector. And she's worked throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. She holds a master's in social work from Columbia and a PhD from University of Toronto. And before coming to Fordham, she was a dean at Barry University in Miami. Well, we also, like most recently, she had a very important position for the Council of Social Work Education, and that is she's the chair of the Commission on Educational Policy and Accreditation Standards. And most recently, and most relevant in terms of what we're doing today, is she's on a newly formed CSWE task force to advance anti-racism, which is looking at developing anti-racism pedagogies within social work education. So we're very pleased to have Dean Deborah McPhee be with us to start off our program. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for joining and participating in today's important and timely discussion, Race, Law, and Social Work, Serving Communities of Color Using Anti-Racism Principles. Social workers, lawyers, and the police have long occupied prominent roles in providing services to communities of color. Sadly, all three professions bear the historical burden of service that has far too often taken the form of surveillance rather than support. The well-intended benevolent values that fueled our primary systems of service at the start, such as child welfare and public housing, education, are now all too rarely reflected in the laws, policies, and practices that govern these systems. They're even more rarely experienced by the people on the receiving end and most directly impacted. We're here today to imagine what these systems might be if they were shaped by a commitment to social justice, anti-racism, and equity. What would they look like if these principles and commitments were at the center of our service goals and practices? It naturally leads to critical questions such as what will it take for social work, law, and law enforcement to move beyond our shared history and fundamentally change our relationships with the communities we serve? How would our professions change if we were to authentically embrace anti-racism and equity? And what are we collectively, are we collectively ready to give up our power, the power of our professions enjoy, to promote power among the citizens of our most marginalized communities? In other words, what will it take for our professions to come together and support meaningful and lasting social, economic, and political change? These are critical and uncomfortable questions that you've come together to engage today. And it's an endeavor that reflects similar efforts that have taken place across the country and as well as here at home. Fordham University's 2020 Action Plan Addressing Racism and Educating for Justice, the Graduate School Social Services Service Action Committee for Racial and Social Justice, and as Elaine had indicated, the Council on Social Education 2020 Task Force for advancing to advance anti-racism are a few of the initiatives that I've had, and over the past year, I've had the great privilege to participate in and support. Efforts such as these and the conversation you'll have today give me hope that we truly do have the ability to move beyond protest to real transformation. I want to thank our panelists, all of our panelists and moderators, for their leadership and their willingness to come today and share their experience and their expertise. I want to certainly extend my gratitude to all those folks that are behind the scenes who have brought together the many pieces and parts that are often required to organize such events. And I certainly want to thank you, all of the participants. Your role is not a passive one, but is essential to both advancing the dialogue and certainly to advancing change in our communities. So without further ado, it is my great privilege to introduce three distinguished members of our GSS community, three amazing women that I'm honored to call colleagues and friends. You've just met Elaine Congress, our professor and associate dean for continuing education and special programs, and a social work education icon for sure. Fordham's new James R. Dumpson Endowed Chair in Child Welfare Studies, and certainly a luminary in many New York communities, Dr. Ann Williams Isom, and associate professor and co-chair of GSS's Action Committee for Racial and Social Justice, and one of the hardest working women I know, Dr. Binta Allen Green. Thank you for allowing me to welcome everyone to today's event, and thank you everyone for your commitment to serving communities of color using anti-racist principles. I will certainly participate as much as I can today, running between events, but I know that it'll be an important discussion, and I want to thank everybody for the role you played in bringing us together today. So thank you, Elaine. I will give it back to you.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks very much, Deborah. For that welcome, and also starting to introduce people on our committee. One thing I've found, I mean, just like it takes a village to raise a child, it takes an extended Fordham community to put on a conference. A conference is the work of many people. And first, I want to begin by thanking our great planning committee. I mean, it really began last summer. Bettina Mashi is a professor at GSS, approached me about, well, maybe she's very involved in forensic social. Maybe we should think about hosting an event about police and social work, given what's happening in our country. We were soon joined by Ann Williams Isom, who began in September as our Dumpson Chair for Child Welfare and really brought so much experience as a lawyer and an honorary social worker, and she's really added so much, to our school and to our committee. And then we also were joined by Dr. Binta Allen Green, who is a faculty member and a co-chair of the Florida Action Committee for Race and Social Justice. And then by Dr. Samita Azar, she's a Fordham faculty member who's long time been interested and concerned about promoting social justice. But from the very beginning, we felt we wanted students to be involved in planning. So what we did was we involved students from different types of students who are with us. We have a student from our doctoral program, Condra Knowles, who you're going to hear from shortly, is one of the speakers. And then we have Celia Goebel from the dual law and social work program, which I had, who's going to be speaking. And then we also have Casey Dean, who's from our MSW program. And they've been very active on the planning committee, and they have major roles in presenting today. And I will tell you, people are very committed. We've been meeting weekly since September to plan this event. So it's been a long time coming. I also want to acknowledge our tech team, because you can't do this. Just, you may have wonderful ideas, but you can't do it until unless you have a really great tech team. I want to announce especially Trish Rodriguez, was very helpful in terms of setting up the registration and kind of organizing the webinar today. Connor White, for his tireless effort in creating the flyers and publicizing the event to everyone. And Matt Roach, he's provided so much technical assistance. So I just want to really have a shout out to these people, our tech team, who make it possible. Now, let us begin. You're probably anxious for the conference to begin. And let me first introduce Dr. Binta Allen Green again. She's the head of our our GSS Race and Social Justice Committee, and she wants to say a few opening comments as we begin this conference. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And I once again want to echo Ellen's, Elaine's comments regarding, that you can be anywhere in the world right now, but you chose to be here with us. And so we thank you for coming today. Again, my name is Dr. Binta Aline Green, and I am one of the co-chairs for the GSS Action Committee for Racial and Social Justice. The Action Committee was formed this summer, last summer, after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and just the constant death of Brown and Black people. And a number of our faculty, students, staff were very concerned about how we as a community here at GSS and the Graduate School of Social Work, how we were going to respond to what was happening in our communities and our country, because so many of us felt that the people that these things were happening to, the people that were being killed, the people that were being murdered, looked like us. And we wanted to come together to bring about change, especially as the Graduate School of Social Service. And so the Action Committee was formed, and we have 3 subcommittees in the Action Committee that's been extremely active this past year. We have the Accountability Committee, which is focused on internal, implicit and explicit curriculum change here at GSS. We also have the Community Building Subcommittee that focuses on creating community, both within GSS and within the larger Fordham and New York City community. So the Community Building Committee consists of students and alumni, staff, all of us kind of coming together and working to create a space where we feel safe and can have discussions about things that's happening. And then we also have the leadership and oh my goodness, why is this skipping my mind? So we have the Activism Committee, excuse me, and the Activism Committee has been tremendously active this year in terms of bringing political and social awareness to with GSS community around things that's happening around elections and voting, and bringing about conversation around whiteness in social work organizations. And so the Action Committee has been very, very, very active, very instrumental in bringing about discussion and initiating change here at GSS. So this was seemed very, very appropriate for us to co-sponsor this event. And again, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. And I hope that you enjoy the conversations and discussions that we have with the panelists. Thank you again. Anne?
Yes. Good morning. I think I am just going to jump into the panel. So if I can ask the panelists to please come on camera: Bennett Capers, Jennifer Jones Austin, Derek Johnson, Renee Lockhart. As was said, I am Ann Williams Isom. But this morning I am, more importantly than the Dumpson Chair at Fordham, I am a mom. I'm a daughter to a 90-year-old mother who lives with me. I'm a wife. My parents are immigrants. I was thinking about it the other day because I have been hearing people saying how their parents came here 400 years ago. And I realized that I've only been in this country, or my people have only been in this country over 60 years. My mom came here when she was 24 years old in search of an American dream. I've dedicated my whole life to Black and brown children and families. And so on a day like today, feels like a day like every day, because even though there's horrible things going on in the news, I was talking to a sister who lives in Minneapolis yesterday, and she said to me that while Brother Wright was killed on Saturday, that next day on Monday, a 16-year-old was approached by another 16-year-old and was asked what set he was in. And he said the wrong set, and he was shot in the back and killed. And she talked to me about how in Minneapolis, Still, the Rite Aid on her corner is not open. Still, several 17-year-olds have been murdered and killed, and the violence that's happening in their community. It was a panel that I did yesterday about community level trauma and advancing equity. So as I see and meet some of you, Bennett and I went to law school together. Jennifer and I have been sisters in the struggle together since we were in our 20s and worked at the Administration for Children's Services. I'm so happy to meet you, Derek and Renee, this morning. But I greet you in the name of the work that we have been doing as people of color for a very long period of time. So this pandemic and all this so-called racial reckoning that has happened over this past year is not new to us. This is our lives. But in spite of that, we have chosen the fields of law, child welfare, right? Social work, and we are constantly trying to come about and do change. So I know you all have fancy credentials that people can read and look at, but I'm going to ask you today because I think our stories, our personal narratives, who we are, why we come to this work, and our lived experience is very important. So I would like you to introduce yourself today as we start this conversation as a way to ground us, brothers and sisters, in the midst of all that is swirling around us. Because I know how I'm coming to this conversation, so I know how you're coming to this conversation, completely heavy and conflicted. Can you please introduce yourself? Tell us why you chose this work and how you come to this work. Who would like to start?
I'll jump in. So let me first just express my appreciation to you all at the Graduate School of Social Service at Fordham University for having this conversation, this very important conversation. If we just look back 2-3 years ago, this would not be happening. Even a year ago, this would not be happening. For so long, there has been, and I say this, working in child welfare and working on poverty issues for many, many years now, decades now. There was this lack of attention paid to the interplay, if you will, the intersection of social work and law enforcement. Very often, it seems the case we talk about race and law enforcement, but we don't talk enough about race and poverty and law enforcement. It's as though we didn't want to put the people in law enforcement or people fighting for criminal justice reform didn't want to be attached to, quote, the welfare moms. And in turn, people doing social work and poverty fighting work didn't want to be attached to the hardcore criminals. And so we didn't bring the three together. And so I appreciate you for doing this. You asked, why we decided to do this work, or each of us decided. I'm going to tell you, and Anne, you know a little bit about this. I don't know if I chose to do it or if I was called to do it. I believe strongly I was actually called to do this work. I am a fourth generation leader of faith and social justice. My grandfather, I always tell people just kind of charmingly, my grandfather was roommates with Martin Luther King Sr. My father was the president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and national chair of Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic justice arm of the SCLC. He and Martin Luther King Jr. and about 8 other persons founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention together. So this work is kind of like, it's in my DNA, it's in my blood. Errol Lewis once said to me, this is kind of a family business. I don't know. But I will tell you that I went to law school years ago not knowing what I wanted to do or be in life. My uncle, who was a civil rights attorney, told me, go to law school, and while you're there, you'll figure it out. And it just so happened that while I was searching for a law review note topic, I happened upon the case of a young man who'd been tried and convicted for the murder of his father. The jury had found that it appeared that he had engaged in, that the murder was premeditated. However, at sentencing, the judge looked at the circumstances of the case and determined that the jury had not really understood that this young man had endured so many years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his father that he lived in a constant state of believing that his life was at risk. And so when he took his father's life, it was believing that he was in imminent danger of being killed by his father, although in the moment, his father actually was sleeping in bed. That case, awakened me, helped me to better appreciate the experience of children who grow up in poverty, and some of whom are subject to abuse, severe abuse at the hands of their parents. And it helped me to appreciate that it's not always the case. It's very rarely the case that their parents are just bad people, but that we live in a society where so many stressors have caused people to do unconscionable acts, where we live with intergenerational trauma, where we live with poverty stressors that cause people to act in certain ways, substance abuse being one of them. And I just began to feel and appreciate that. And as I said, I'm a child of faith, a leader of faith, that the Lord was saying to me, yeah, you may have thought you came here and you were going to do some corporate law work and maybe make some big bucks, but I want you to work on behalf of my vulnerable children, help serve, save, and protect them. So that's how I got here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Who would like to go next? I see Derek smiling, so I think I might go to you.
No, I was just smiling because Jennifer's story, it resonates with me so much. But I'm Derek. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. We're in southeastern Michigan, so the county right next to Wayne, which is where the city of Detroit is. How did I get in this work? Well, quite honestly, I never thought about being a police officer, right? I'm a social worker who became a police officer. In my neighborhood where I grew up, we did not have a really good relationship with law enforcement. And I won't walk you through all the details, but I just never envisioned myself being in law enforcement until the guy who's the sheriff, my boss now, came to me. He said, hey, you're this community guy, this social worker, you're doing all this great stuff in the neighborhoods. What if you could do some of that community organizing and community building work through a police agency? And my first answer was like, man, get out of here. You crazy. First of all,
You're like, how about no?
I'm not never gonna work for the police, and it's not gonna work. But honestly, over time, he started to really convince me of like, this is the epicenter of some of the issues we care about most as social workers. Our jails are full of people who are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, people who suffer from mental health issues, who suffer from substance use disorder, who are homeless. It's unfortunate, they shouldn't be there, but our jails all across this country are some of our largest mental health institutions. And then it was my father who, as I'm debating this back and forth, he just said, listen, Derek, you're always talking about policing needs to be better. If you really believe that, then go do something about it, right? In my neighborhood, the same neighborhood I live in to this day, which is in Washtenaw County, the police agency that I work at services this area, a man was killed in our custody. I was one of the community leaders marching in the street calling for change. And so, you know, for me, it's a personal, lifelong journey to get here. I never saw myself doing this work. But now looking back, all the steps from when I was a young person watching how police interacted with us to going to social work school, doing work with homeless kids, knowing that even though we had policies to kind of keep law enforcement away from the kids who were in our shelter, now in retrospect, when I look back, it was often police who were bringing kids to the shelter, like the first connection. Or an officer who was the first connection to the woman who had just been battered to the, you know, to safe house in our community. So I say all that to say that I think there's a bridge there that I didn't see a long time ago. But that's kind of why I do this work now.
Thank you so much, Derek. And I love it because we have students listening to us who are in social work school, they're in law school, they're in thinking in law enforcement. So I think I also want them to know that sometimes you start something and you actually don't know where you're going to end up and how you're going to be called to do this work. Bennett, I want to call you Professor Capers to kind of tease you, but I'm just going to call you Bennett. So why don't you go next, and Renee, you're next. Oh, are you muted? I can't hear you.
No, I'm muted. So
there you go. Okay.
Yes, and Bennett is fine. So before I became a professor, 12, 14 years ago, I was a federal prosecutor for close to a decade. So I've been sort of in the criminal system world for quite a while. And I will say I fell into it. So to follow up on what Anne was saying, I sort of completely fell into prosecution. I did not go to law school intending to be a prosecutor. I did not graduate law school intending to be a prosecutor. I intended to go to a firm and make lots of money. But then when I went to a firm, I was bored silly. So I decided, I'll just do something else. And federal prosecution just became available, so I did that. That being said, it's an interesting question. I mean, I wish Paul Butler, who teaches at Georgetown, famously asked several years ago, should good people be prosecutors? And his answer was no. And I have to say, I sort of feel very conflicted about the work I did as a prosecutor.
Right.
And I will say now, as a criminal law professor and a criminal procedure professor, so much of the way I teach is sort of putting out all the problems with the criminal system, especially problems that the Supreme Court has enabled. So I'm very much conflicted about the work we do on this side of, this on behalf of the state.
Thank you, Bennett. Renee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for having me and allowing me to be on this esteemed panel. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. So I've been a Raleigh police officer for 19 years. But it didn't start out that way. I was born and raised in Charlotte. And yes, I'm country, y'all, and I talk with my hands. So expect for me to do all of that. I went to school for social work. So my undergraduate degree is in social work, and I have a master's in social work. So why did I decide to be a police officer, you ask? Well, when I was taking my social work classes, and learned a lot and picked up a lot, the things that I learned wasn't reality to me, like, oh, we all are, it was too fluffy, not very realistic. For me in school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. It was either you become a teacher or maybe you become a social worker. I didn't have a family that said you have to go to college or do any of those things. I did all of that on my own and got track and field to help me be able to go to North Carolina State University, where I was able to get a degree. As a social work student, I did an internship at a mental health hospital working in the forensic unit. And when I graduated, I just decided, you know what, I think I want to step into law enforcement because I want to help people that are in immediate crisis. On top of that, I'd never seen anybody in a uniform that looked like me. And so I said, you know what, I'm gonna step up and jump into this, just jump right into it, but bring myself and bring the educational experience that I have as a social worker into the profession. And I have done that every day since.
Thank you so much. And
I just want to jump in and say that I really appreciate hearing from everyone. When I talk about the intersection, I'm glad to hear the work that Derek and Renee are doing and why they did. When I say that this intersection has not really been carried forward, I'm talking about in the policy and legislation space. Mm-hmm. Not so much on the ground, but in the systems change work.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation because towards the end, one of the questions that we got in from students was, how do you feel conflicted in the work that you're doing? And you all kind of touched on that, so we may come back to that. But I want to go into another thing right now. I was going to talk about solutions, but I'm going to come back to that. What I want to say is, now we have heard so much about dismantling systems. And when I say systems, I'm including the child welfare system, where Jennifer and I were a part of for many years from inside the system and then worked outside of, and the police department. So now I know the law enforcement. I don't think that there's any abolitionists on this panel, but I don't know. I don't want to assume. But I want you to tell me, why do you think incremental change is the way that we should go, as opposed to kind of just dismantling a broken system? I often say it is clear that this system was not built with abundance in mind and in terms of bringing communities along. So is it possible for us to kind of come together, or do we need to kind of break down and rebuild something different? That question is for all of you. Who wants to jump into it first?
I'll start, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I am a component for incremental change. And there is the defund the police and abolish the police department. Well, what I'll tell you is one of the first units that would be defunded would likely be my unit, Currently, I'm assigned to the youth services unit. So we are completely preventative based. I tell everybody it's all happy thoughts my way. During the school year, we're actually in elementary schools engaging with youth and lessons that they already learned in health class, but actually talking to a law enforcement officer. And then during the summer, we run our own summer camps. So we're not wearing uniforms. We're, out there playing with kids and having continued connections, not just, dog and pony show, people say those I don't really know you type of interactions, but continued interactions. If we defund the police or abolish police, specialized units that do a lot of community oriented type of policing will be the first to go. I'm also a police instructor. I'm a teacher. So I teach those special population topics and things, domestic violence response, all of those things. Training will lack if we automatically just defund the police. So I think incremental change is necessary, and we just have to think more about that.
Who wants to jump in? Go ahead, Bennett.
Yeah, I have to jump in. So I used to describe myself as abolitionist curious, but increasingly I'm on the abolitionist bandwagon. And really, when we're talking about defunding the police, just to be clear, we're not talking about like, oh, defund the police and that's it. We're actually talking about shifting resources to other areas. And obviously I haven't met Officer Lockhart. I have a lot of respect for you, but in all honesty, I don't have children, but if I had children, I don't need the police playing with my children. We don't need the police to do things like that. We don't need the police to do traffic stops. We don't need police to have guns during traffic stops. I mean, there are all these things we don't have, and Derek Jackson mentioned that, our prisons are filled with people with mental illness. We don't need the police handling people with mental illness. I mean, we need to reimagine the whole system. And the same goes for, I'm not a social worker. I know almost next to nothing about child protective services, but my guess is there used to be a time when communities handle things. Like, we don't need everybody up in everybody's business all the time, especially the state.
I know. I'm looking at Jennifer and Derek. Who wants to jump in? I'm trying to hold neutral for the moment. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So here's the way that I look at it. I give this analogy of, for any large skyscraper that was built that you want to demolish, right? You want to get rid of it. You can't just run in, throw dynamite everywhere and hit detonate, right? You have to have just as many architects planning to demolish it as you did to build it. You have to know its strengths, its weaknesses, its vulnerabilities. You have to build alternative structures so you can move your stuff out of that old building into the new one before you ever place your first stick of dynamite. And so what I often say, whether it's abolition, defunding or not, how are we intentional and smart about the changes we want to see? The last thing I want to see is that changes that we think are important, that are made out of rash decisions and emotions that really have unintended consequences that hurt the communities that we really are saying we're focused on the most. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do one or the other. Quite honestly, I never try to say to someone, don't defund, don't abolish, don't do this. What I say is, if you fully understand the complexity and the context of the system, then you can make the best decisions of the changes you need in your community, because this is a community by community decision. Yeah. My agency is very different than Renee's, and the surrounding community is very different. And so I think that a one size catch all. I do agree with Bennett that, and you'll hear a lot of officers say this around, there are certain things that I shouldn't have to respond to. Right. But until we have these alternative systems in place that are effective alternative systems. And we can talk about the social work piece of that, not just throwing social workers in there, but the right training, abilities, and resources to be effective, I think are an important piece to shift that direction.
Jennifer, back in September, you had a panel calling Shifting Power, and you were very concerned that when people say defund the police and we're going to send it to social services organizations are pretty damn racist themselves. And how were we going to think about that? I know you have tons of things to say about this topic, but I just wanted to bring in that was one of our concerns as we talk about it. And Derek, I'm stealing that skyscraper analogy. So sorry, thank you.
I'm going to jump in here and try to pull all that together and bring in the defund the police. Dr. Williams-Isom knows that I am in the process of finalizing and soon will release a book titled God in the Ghetto, A Prophetic Word Revisited. It's a seminal work that my father published in 1979, which deconstructs racism in our society and the role that religion has played in birthing it and perpetuating it. In it, he describes the system that we are fighting against, the system that essentially props up racism to ensure that there are certain people who will perpetually have and others who will not. And he refers to the system as a trifecta that is centered on racism, capitalism, and militarism, right? Now, I bring this in because what we're dealing with right now is militarism in policing. And when people talk about abolishing the system and when they talk about defunding the police, if you get close to them, many of them are not just talking about just ridding ourselves of policing in America. They're really focusing on the militarization of policing in America. The fact that, as we for decades have gone into other countries and have waged war in other countries in order to acquire and appropriate. What we're doing here in America right now is we've waged war on certain communities. We engage in certain places policing in more violent tactics and aggressive tactics to shut people down, right? So when we talk about defunding the police, is it that we just want it completely gone? No, but the militarization of policing is what we want to do away with. The waging of war on specific communities. Defunding the police, I shared this with Ann and other people, was a challenging term. I took issue with it, as somebody who is concerned about the militarization in our country against Black and Brown people. Defunding is really about disinvesting. It's about budget justice. It's about putting money into the programs that, that Renee speaks of, and that Bennett speaks, that we're all speaking of. It's about imagining a system where we're not making it a crime, that is worthy of death because you ran a light, right? Or because you are mentally ill and challenged. Your life should not come to an end because, all of a sudden the police are called and 20 people show up. And when you're, you're having a moment and you're having a downfall, the guns get pulled on you. Defunding the police is really about disinvesting in the militarization of our policing system and investing in life and in human beings.
Thank you, Jen. And the next question that I'm going to ask of the panel is going to be about what do you think is working as a way to get there? But before I go there, Jen, I know that you recently have been appointed to the mayor's only, I think, there's no other city in the US that has this, that's really trying to address structural racism in terms of what policies and procedures could we put into the city charter to start to make some changes in that area. I also know that you are on the mayor's task force for community and policing reform. I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about that from a policy perspective? What is it that you think you're going to be able to do? Just a little, we could talk about that for the whole time. So just a snippet. And then I want to
very quickly, the Racial Justice Committee. The Racial Justice Commission, it's the first of its kind in the nation, is intended to look at structural and institutional racism as propped up by municipal government. So essentially going into the charter of the City of New York, which is our Constitution, and looking at power, access, opportunity, capacity, and accountability, how our systems are structured to keep power residing within certain pockets of the city and certain people, how access is denied people, and I go on and on. We're going to be looking at everything from policing to education, healthcare, housing, environmental justice. Who gets to decide where we put the pollutant corporations? Who gets to decide who controls the pensions, procurement, and other things, and then making structural changes, knowing that you can make the policy changes, but the next administration can come in and then undo those. So how do you look at the laws of the land and address them as it concerns equity and opportunity? The work on the Police Reform Commission helped me to appreciate that very often what happens is we look at some of these issues, we believe, let's just take the issue of implicit bias. Everybody says we need more implicit bias training. But what the Policing Reform Commission helped me to appreciate is that implicit bias training is helpful, but that does not end racialized policing. It does not bring it in to the criminalization of poverty. It helps you maybe to appreciate that this is an issue, but it doesn't undo that situation. It helps us to appreciate that it needs to be a both and approach, that you need to be looking at accountability measures and not just discipline and transparency, but you need to be looking at what gets rewarded in policing, and what is not paid attention to. We don't reward police officers who are doing a good job of connecting with community and building meaningful relationships.
Renee just gave you 2 snaps, Jen.
So that's just an example. It's looking at what the policing reform work helped me to appreciate that these kind of throw up your hands and let's do this are stopgap measures, and they don't really get into root cause analysis. And that's the work we have to do.
Anybody have a reaction to anything that Jennifer said?
Yeah, I was going to snap it up. I'll also just say this. We talk about it as a triangle. It's training, it's policy, and accountability, right? So you can do all the training you want. If you don't have the right policy or accountability, you won't actually change the behavior in the middle of that for officers. So it's much more complex, and that's what I mean by understanding the full system. Jennifer hit it right, the nail on the head.
Bennett, can I ask you, you've done so much research on the history of race and policing in America. What has worked? What do you think are the things that need to happen?
Anne, the way you started this program, like just mentioning recent events, sort of suggests that nothing is working, which is why I'm not a big fan of small reforms.
Right.
We've seen reforms, and that doesn't really change the reality on the ground. The program began by sort of saying like, oh, all of this was sort of prompted out of the killing of George Floyd. Now we're dealing with that trial. But the fact is, this has been going on for as long as you and I can remember, Anne, and before we were born.
Yep.
Last year, the New York Times described the Black Lives Matter protest as the largest in history. 15 to 26 million people participated in protest. I got invited to so many panels, and the first question was, are you optimistic? And it's like, okay, well, here we are a year later.
Right.
I'm not seeing much working, to answer your question.
Right.
And well, I appreciate everything the co-panelists are saying. I don't mean to disagree with them, but at bottom, we also have to look at okay, well, why is X a crime and not Y a crime?
Right.
Why are we prosecuting people for drugs in the first place? There are all these things that we just take for granted, and we just need to really go back and just question everything.
Right.
We can try to make New York less structurally racist as much as we want. We have an education system that's predicated on racism. Everything about the system is predicated on racism. So unless you plan on revisiting everything and starting from scratch and telling people everybody who's advantaged now that they have to give up some of their advantages, give up their private school education for their kids, give up the tutoring for their kids, give up the segregation for their kids, then it's not going to happen. Hate to be a pessimist, but I'm a pessimist.
Jump in, Jen. But
I appreciate what you're saying, Bennett, but I also appreciate, like you, having been at this work for about, and I guess now nearing 30 years, that these changes do not come overnight, and that it has to be structural and institutional in nature, as well as on the ground, every day building out the reform. And so when I talk about structural change, yes, we are going to be looking at how the New York City education system is structured such that certain people have and certain people don't. The fact that we have a per pupil allocation as an example, and we suggest that that's equalizing the playing field, but you can go to certain communities in New York City and find that the PTA Association is able to plug in $2 million in 1 year to add paraprofessionals to the classroom, whereas the community, in the Bronx or in Brownsville, New York, can maybe at best raise $250 through a bake sale. That's not equalizing the playing field. And so to your point, the work we have to do is call these issues out, structural, institutional, and what it looks like in design, implementation, and ultimately disparate impact. So I'm with you.
I hear what Bennett is saying is that he's kind of pissed off Because even if we do all of these wonderful things, it's going to be another 60 years. And how many Black and brown children are going to be left behind, right? Jen, you and I were talking about that yesterday. So we see some on television, but we don't see all that's happening in communities. And it's not about people's individual behaviors. It's about what systems are doing to them. So I think what everybody's saying is right, but we have a right to be pissed off and not to just kind of just say we're gonna move along and everything is good. But we're glad that we're in these places. Derek and Renee, I want to bring you into this conversation. What do you see that's working? Derek, 1 second. Renee, I know that you're doing your part in your community. What are the things that you think are working, and what do you wish that we were doing more of? And I want to give everybody a heads up. We got 10 more minutes. I told people I'm the best facilitator ever, and we're going to wrap up at 11. So Renee, you go, and then Derek, I'd love to hear what your solutions are.
So just speaking specifics, just talking about my city and how we operate. I know that Bennett said that, he doesn't need his children to be around police or be with police, but that's what my community asked for. They wanted us involved because we actually went out there and had roundtable discussions, many of them, and asked our community, what can we do better and what are some things that we can do? And that's part of our strategic plan as a police department, but then also the city's strategic plan. So just on a national level, one of the things that was working was a 21st century policing model, which includes community-oriented policing. It discusses implicit bias and diversity training. And I agree with Jennifer on everything she said regarding implicit bias and things. One of the organizations that I joined that has definitely, it's been helpful for me in seeing how we can better policing is NOBLE. It's the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And what they're doing is they're creating a task force, which is called Reimagining Public Safety. And they're talking about acknowledging our past harms, the lack of education, reviewing community resources and concerns with the community, and staying community oriented. And then also being advocates for key federal, state, and local policy changes. Those are all things that are working and we can work on more of.
Thank you so much. Derek.
Yeah, I was, the fact that we're having this conversation, we weren't, I think Jennifer started her story off, we weren't having this conversation even 2 years ago about social workers, about the shifting of resources. Here in the state of Michigan, the legislator passed into law in January, it took effect in January, a series of law changes that decriminalizes certain kinds of traffic related things. Prosecutors in Washington County have a new prosecutor who stopped charging certain kinds of crimes. And so you start to see this shift where in the past that would be unheard of, but that ball or that boulder is slowly moving. Bennett, to your point, I agree with you, brother. Like, it's taking too long, right? And I'm sure it's going to take long for us to really get to where we ultimately want to. But there are these steps that I see of things changing. I'll just give you some that are specific to law enforcement. How we hire is changing, right? The kind of competencies we're looking for in people is changing. Simultaneously, we need the community. I never wanted to be a police officer. It's like pulling teeth to get brothers to even think about law enforcement, right? So both hands, extending to increase that relationship. The 21st Century Policing Commission, ABLE, like all these are things that I think in larger systems of law enforcement are really starting to shift to have these kinds of discussions. And so if we had more time, I would go into all of those details, but I just think that you see the subtle changes, but you also see significant changes, even in being able to watch this trial on television. We would have never. Last one I'll give you, just yesterday, we had it was a small complaint from a mom that came in. We sat down with the deputy, with the sergeant, with the mom, with her advocate, her husband, and her children. And we watched the video and we talked through as a community. And at the end of that mom said, like, this is all I needed. All I needed was to have this discussion for you to hear me. We got new information to further the case. Now we're going to go after charges on another person, for her to see the video herself. And I said to her, I said, this is the long, arduous, hard process of creating and building trust and community. These are the kinds of things that need to happen on a regular basis. And the fact that we can have this conversation, I think, is just endemic of that.
It is part of the work. I know some people are like, oh, we gotta, we have to do this. But I think these conversations, again, which can be informative and healing and connect us, right? So that we could see each other and witness what we're going through, is also part of the work. Let me see, what do I want to talk about next? I think the focus on the interdisciplinary need to approach these issues, we didn't connect on that a lot in this conversation. And so we kind of put you all out there as lawyers who are doing social work or police officers who have social work backgrounds. Is there something important even about how we face these and address these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective? What do you all think about that? Bennett.
Yes, there's something important. Like we have to always see sort of the big picture. We always have to connect these things. If I'm following the question, yes. But if I could just add, I think one thing we also need to do, like if I could just go back to law enforcement for a second, we need to also start thinking of crime as a symptom of a larger problem and figure out how to attack the issues that are creating crime. So I'm all for like, oh, there's crime, let's address crime, but we got to address like, okay, well, why is there all this income inequality that's spurring this crime? Why is there's this educational inequality? Why is this lack of housing? So that's where I come from on this. And also, can I just say a word about social work, which I know nothing about, but my concern is social work has become law enforcement adjacent. So we have to be concerned about how much social work is sort of facilitating unequal policing the same way policing does.
So I was having a conversation with colleagues. I know, Jennifer, I see your face, you want to jump in, but we were talking about neglect and how neglect is defined. And do we have to really define it that way? Because a lot of neglect, 80% of it is about poverty. And so if we didn't make that something that we had to investigate as mandated reporters, would then less kids Black and brown kids be coming into the front door of the child welfare system? My question, yes, I want to clarify the question. It was just about, we tend to look at some of these issues from a siloed perspective. And my question was, does that hurt? Is that good? Does that, I know people have special expertise. And so do we need special expertise, or is an interdisciplinary approach better when we're dealing with the communities? But Jen, I see your face. What you want to say to Bennett? Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you, Bennett. I think you hit it right on the head. In America, we not only racialize policing, we criminalize poverty. Here in New York City, just as an example, 60% of the crimes that are committed in New York City that are captured by the police, if you will, are attributable to poverty. Now, why is that? That's because the police are in the low-income communities of color. Here in New York City, 10 of the community districts with the highest rates of incarceration are also overlapping with the community districts with the highest rates of poverty and people of color. 80% of the people who are in jail, detained on Rikers Island, are poor. And that's because we are policing poverty. 1/3 of the arrests in 2016 were for jumping the turnstile here in New York City. Where were the cops going to find people jumping the turnstile? They were going to low-income communities. We criminalize poverty. And so you cannot address policing reform if you don't look, as Bennett is talking about, what brings about poverty in the first place. And that's why the role of social work is so critically important. That's on the front end, and then on the back end. Our human service agencies doing poverty fighting work, they're actually just managing poverty right now.
That's right.
They're not trying to end poverty. They're managing poverty, because they're not even playing into the fact that the majority of people who they're working with are either directly justice involved or their families have been justice involved. And I'll say one last stat. There are 10 times, Rikers has 10 times the number of people with mental health issues than the mental health institutions in New York City hold. We are policing poverty, mental health, substance abuse, and all of that, and not doing the social work to prevent it and intervene in appropriate ways.
All right.
Can I just mention, I hate to add up, can I just mention the foster care to prison pipeline? I will just leave it at that.
Yeah, 100%. What I want to do, because it is 10:55, is start to close this part of the session. The next session that we're going to be having is with students, I keep on saying young people, but I guess at 57, they are young people to me, to talk about them going into this field, right? And do they have the education and the tools that they need to really bring an anti-racist perspective to the work, to the careers, to the calling that they want to do, right? I don't want them to go into these fields and feel like there's nothing I can do. I'm just pushing a boulder uphill. There are things that we can do. And it is important that we are doing this work, those of us who want to end oppression and to want to end racism. So as we come to a close on this panel, I would like each of you to tell me, how do you keep your heart in this work? What gives you hope? How do you, and especially on a day like today or every day, you know, when there's so much despair and there's so much anger, right? That's the word. And we've got to hold the anger and this something else. And so I want to know how do you keep your heart in this work and what gives you hope? Renee, thank you so much for being on this panel. I see you in your uniform and it's just kind of making my heart sing, because I'm happy you're there. I worry for you, right? And I'm glad that you are doing the work that you do. And I would love if you could tell us, how do you keep your heart in this, and what gives you hope?
Yes. How do I keep my heart into it? And I'll just piggyback off the last question and add in, I have social work students that come and work in specialized positions within the police department. So I take in interns, graduate level and undergraduate, and those positions have eventually become a permanent position, like the trauma counselor. There are things that we don't think about, domestic violence, where social work components are needed within the police department. And so how do I hope? Things like Noble gives me hope, being a part of that organization, because we didn't get to talk about how conflicted I am. And I definitely am. Black Lives Matter to me. I have a son that I'm concerned about. I have a husband that is not a police officer, and my father, you know, so hope is in making sure that, you know, we do have a voice and we have a seat at the table, not just at the top, but throughout, and we're able to actually bring about real change, inclusivity, all of that within law enforcement. That's what gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Renee. Brother Derek, thank you for being, one second.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for being on this panel. I think I've done a lot of panels. This was very dynamic. I think it's going to help increase people's understanding and having, you know, the strength and the courage to be here to speak about all these different angles that you bring to it has been very helpful to us. So thank you so much, Brother Derek.
Thank you for having me. And I would just say what inspires me and keeps me in this work is, Sister Renee said it, we in law enforcement work at real crisis, right? I thought I worked at real crisis when I was a social worker doing direct service, but when you get that 911 call, there's the crisis. And the ability to really make sure that things are being done the right way on an everyday basis. This is what we are called to do. Like this is why we are here at this moment in time. I'll tell you, these discussions are not easy, but that really fuels me. I think the last part I'll mention is, for social workers in particular, I was the person marching in the street. And I'll just say this, someone said to me before, if you're only marching in the streets, the people who are inside the system who don't want to see change will just build stronger walls and bigger doors to keep you out. At some point, someone, and some of that sustainable change from the inside out, to open that door and let folks in, just as people are pushing the door and trying to knock it down, we need both. And so for some of the students who are on the call, I think not everybody is meant to work within the systems. I know that. But for some of you listening, you really are. So we need both kind of working hand in hand. That's what inspires me.
Thank you so much, Derek. Bennett, I want to come to you. I want to say thank you so much. I'm so proud of your career. I'm so happy to have you as a colleague now at Fordham so that we can make good trouble together. So I'm looking forward to that. Tell me what gives you hope and how do you keep your heart in this work?
So first, thanks for having me. I look forward to making good trouble with you. And I just have to build on what Renee said about a seat at the table, and Derek about, you know, having people on the inside. I'm all for that. Because I think from the inside, you can begin to change the system. One thing that gives me hope is, you know, something I've written about, which is the year 2044, when this country is slated to switch from being majority white to majority minority. And I see that as hopeful, because I think when people who've been on the bottom have more seats at the table, they will actually envision a more egalitarian, equal world. So it won't
Amen.
be like come up and so be like, no, this is how things should be for everybody.
Right.
Everybody should have equality.
Thank you so much, Professor Bennett. Jennifer, my sister, you are so busy. There's so many things on your plate. So I know you said the yes because you wanted to come here and support this work that we're doing at Fordham. So thank you so much for all that you're doing for children and families, for your life of service, and for putting your very important voice into this conversation today. What gives you hope, my sister, and how do you keep your heart in this work?
Two things, feeling called and purpose to this moment and this work. Being, as I've shared at the very beginning, a leader of faith and a child of God, I know that if I'm here, it's for a reason and for a purpose. And I just lean into my Lord and Savior Christ, who suffered, and in his suffering had purpose. So, as we struggle, I just center on that every day is not going to be a great day. There are going to be many bad days, but if my work has meaning, and even if I suffer through it, and then sometimes challenged, it has purpose. So that's what keeps me centered and grounded. And then I'll quickly share something that my daughter taught me that maybe benefits the graduate students. My daughter, who's a graduate student herself, said to me one day, you always have to think about Gramsci's war of position versus war of maneuver, and appreciate that war of position is operating from within to affect the change that is necessary. Taking on a position of war maneuver means you work from the outside and you agitate. And so there is value in both. And whatever space you occupy in whatever moment, that is your space to wage a war.
Thank you so much, panelists. And I will now turn this over to Professor Machi to link us to the second panel. Thank you so much, everyone.
I want to welcome everyone to Fordham University. Under the stewardship of Dean McPhee, we are moving towards an anti-racist school, a curriculum, and also with the race committee. And I want to show everyone our mission statement, which is all about educating for human rights and social justice. And that's really been the bailiwick of our school since we've been formed. Over 100 years, we've been following that tradition. And we're continuing to evolve in the way that we're practicing human rights and social justice. And I have to say, when I think about all of our faculty, we are grappling with it from many different angles, whether we do it from the aging or through youth or through a different service system. And I resonate with what Dr. William Isom and others spoke about on the panel, because it really does capture that conflict that really needs to be resolved as we move forward. And we are here to educate this next generation of social work students, or those that have the call to social work. And when I was a practitioner within a juvenile justice facility, I was there for about 15 years and also spent years in the prison system. And it really was very challenging to witness what was going on in the prisons, but also the communities of there was a lot of violence going on in the community. And many of the youth who left the facility after they finished their term would go home to the communities and often get shot and killed on the street due to community violence. And this is a community mural that I actually recently photoed. But when working in the system and the loss, and it was very sad to be a practitioner within the setting, understanding that there was just so many issues going on within the system, but also in the communities. And there was a sense of moral injury as those that are also witnessing the event. So that really compelled me to want to go into social work. And I also think about all my colleagues too. I'm just one of Fordham faculty, feeling the call to this mission that we at the GSS, we've all come here to coalesce around this idea. We've got the action committee where you've met Dr. Aline Green already, as well as Dr. Azar. But there's so many of us that are doing the good work. And I encourage you to go to the Fordham webpage. I have the link here on the slide, there's so many faculty that are doing so many things in terms of understanding the problems and looking for the solutions. We have been grappling with that and moving forward with that. And that's opportunities, as you'll hear from the students, as they often work with many professors here, trying to address the issues that within all the different service systems related around developing anti-racism principles and practices, or understanding the barriers and the facilitators to really achieving systemic change. So when I think about the students, and I also think about my colleagues too, because I thought a lot about it too, I thought this Martin Luther King quote, and all about answering the call, as we discussed earlier. And this quote is as follows: whatever career you may choose for yourself, doctor, social worker, lawyer, teacher, let me propose an avocation to be pursued along with it. Become a dedicated fighter for civil rights. Make it a central part of your life. It will make you a better doctor, a better social worker, lawyer, a better teacher. It will enrich your spirit as nothing else possibly can. It will give you the rare sense of nobility that can only spring from love and selflessly helping your fellow man. Make a career of humanity. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. So he calls us to a higher purpose here in answering this call. And that resonates with a lot of students, and also it reminds me whether my colleagues resonate with it and those of you listening do, but it does remind me. I also want to bring attention to answering the call from Dorothy Height, well-known civil rights and women's rights activist, administrator, and educator. And I dedicate this first quote to Dee McPhee, because this reminds me a lot of her and how she inspires others to this height. As more women enter public life, I see developing a more humane society. The growth and development of children no longer will depend solely upon the status of their parents. Once again, the community as an extended family will rekindle its caring and nurturing. Though children cannot vote, their interests will be placed high on the political agenda, for they are indeed the future. And this is where the boy with the star in the eyes, it reminds me, he's looking towards the future of that butterfly that we can transform into. Dorothy Height, I'd also like to leave with, and as we're shifting to moving towards the next generation of social justice, those that receive the social justice calling, those that are some highly well-known in their communities for the work they do, but also students at Fordham. But she said about the work, and most human rights activists say this too, is that you get as far as you can go. And the most important thing is that you make sure that the next generation is prepared to do the work, because we'll get as far as we can. This is a journey that we're going to be on, but let's get as far as we can get, make sure the next generation is prepared. And so that's what I feel a lot that we do at Fordham. And I know all of my colleagues are so dedicated to the work. We're all very passionate about it. I think that's one thing we norm about on it. We might have different ways we go about it, but we do it. And also students too have their calling, their niche that they want to go towards. But this is what she says in terms of moving forward. I want to be remembered as someone who used herself at anything she could touch to work for justice and freedom. I want to be remembered as someone who tried. So without further ado, I want to pass the torch over to Kendra Knowles, who will facilitate the student panel and show just some of the examples of solutions that students have been working on, whether it be research, practice, or education. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mashi. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon. I'm also a doctoral student at Fordham, but I'll be moderating and facilitating the second panel that you guys are about to witness. You'll be hearing the experiences of panelists that are students in the graduate, so MSW program, and both the doctoral program here at Fordham, but they're also pursuing not just their studies, but they're also very active in the field. And so they'll also be sharing the work that they have done in their communities and what kind of led them to this work. I know one thing in our first panel that Mrs. Jennifer Jones shared was that policy needs to reflect, right, what we want to see, and the value that Dr. Mashi just shared about us doing our work is that we make that connection. So the research that we do in our studies aligns with helping create that policy change. So I want to welcome Casey Dean, Carlos Rojas, Celia Goebel, Felicia Pullen. Welcome, you guys. So these are all students at Fordham University. And so social justice is a focus and a priority because you guys are here. And so for those individuals that are attending, that are thinking about studying and trying to make that connection between policy research and practice work, I just wanted you guys to start, please just share like what in your personal experience or work background led you to either social work, the law, or both. And let's start with you, Casey.
Sure. So thanks so much, Kadra, for that introduction and for that question. It's really such a privilege to be here, and it will be hard to follow the prior conversation because it was just so great. But yeah, I think for me, you know, in my experience, I identify as white, so I have a lot of experiences that, you know, fit into the white privilege spectrum of the United States. And I think, you know, coming to that awakening of how can we like even the playing field for folks, that's something that really drove me to pursue social work and pursue an MSW so that we can look at policies from a strength-based perspective and a trauma-informed perspective. So that's kind of my calling to this work.
Thank you. We're going to go over to you, Carlos. What led you into the field?
Good morning, everybody. So it's I feel very honored to be part of this panel. It's a great opportunity. I think it's a great topic. I believe for me, as a first-generation immigrant to the United States, part of my personal experience and what I have sort of gone through so far has been what has motivated me to the work, right? I share a lot of the experience that Dr. Bennett and Derek shared earlier in terms of working from the inside. I've been in private practice for many years. I've also worked in communities of color primarily, both in social service agencies and in schools. And I feel like I ended up at a place where I felt like I needed to go further in order to be able to affect change. So, you know, working on the front lines felt like I was putting out fires, and that didn't seem like it was going far enough. So, you know, it led me to a decision to pursue, you know, a higher degree in order to try to affect change from the inside.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Felicia, and then we'll go to Celia.
Hi, Kendra, thank you. And it's great to be here with everyone. The common theme that I heard in the other panel was that, you know, most of the individuals didn't choose their work chose them. And I certainly fall into that category. I spent 30 years selling media marketing and advertising. And one thing that I heard from one of the earlier panelists was that, and then I became bored. I became more than bored. I very much fell into active addiction. And so I heard a lot about substance misuse from the earlier panel. And it's because of my journey in active addiction and then my journey in recovery that social work chose me. I knew that I wanted to come back to the community that raised me. And so that is the community of Harlem. So I was very clear about where I wanted to do the work. I was very clear about who I wanted to work with, people of color, people like me. And I was very clear about the what, which was the substance misuse prevention for teens and youth. And then with adults, I ended up doing and am doing some great work on the recovery side. So this work chose me, but I'm really grateful and happy to be here and to have a voice in many tables, which I would not have had I still been selling ad space. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan. We're going to get to, at the end, more to your work as well, Felicia, because I think a lot of persons need to hear about that as well with your nonprofit. So stay tuned for that. And last, but surely not least.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm very honored and privileged to be here today. The way that I came to be doing both law and social work as a student was actually from a previous career. I grew up in a very affluent suburb and then ended up moving around quite a lot in my early 20s. Ended up here in New York, where I started working in museums. And while I did not expect museum education to lead me to do a lot of work with first generation students, teenagers from low income communities, I started hearing several threads of obstacles that they were facing and concerns that they had. And I remember one of my interns turned to one of our speakers one day and asked how you could possibly have a family and have a really powerful career as a woman. And I thought the fact that somebody would be asking that in the 21st century was really jarring. So I started looking into ways to advocate for those students that I was working with. And ultimately that led me to law school and then to apply to the MSW as well.
Thank you all for sharing those. Those are very powerful and very different. And I think that's the value of the second panel. It's very diverse. And so the experiences of each of you are going to add so much value to persons tuning in. I wanted to focus on first Celia and Carlos, because you both have a background with youth. And the theme of our day, we're looking a lot more at anti-racist principles and practices that can be used. And maybe we'll start with you, Celia, because you kind of touched on it. What in your experiences, either as an obstacle, a challenge, or maybe solutions within your organizations that they put in place that represented something that was anti-racist or represented anti-racist principles that really helped the youth, either in foster care and education, anything that comes to mind around things you've experienced that would offer some tools to persons listening in?
So sure, I think there have been various points in my experiences so far, both as a museum educator and as an intern at legal organizations that have really spoken to that. I've found that a lot of the communities that I have worked with have been communities of color. And I think that having members of the law firm, members of the museum community, who really represent those communities has been a powerful statement, just in terms of having a seat at the table, as they were discussing about during the first panel, which has been really helpful, as well as just having conversations among staff about anti-racism and about what more we can do has been really powerful and really helpful to me.
Great, thank you. So conversation and representation. Carlos, what about you?
I think earlier in the panel, it was touched upon just having open discussions and, being able to just openly discuss the issues that affect the community. I think that that's very powerful in terms of helping individuals feel like they have the ability to have influence. Systemically, however, I feel like my experience in public urban schools has been very challenging. They're often overwhelmed with so many problems and often are in a position to be reactive, that the idea of trying to address issues from a proactive perspective becomes a challenge. One of the things in one of my prior lives, I also have had a lot of time devoted to sports. I think sports has been something that, in terms of communities of color, offers an opportunity for positive youth development. And that oftentimes when there's crises with budgets, tends to be the things that, get affected first, right? The arts and sports. So I think that for me, working, I guess, from the ground up, that's what I've witnessed, right? The fact that it's been very much a challenge because of, the overwhelming amount of issues that come to places like public schools or social service agencies. One area where I have definitely seen positive impact has definitely been sports and the arts.
Nice. And we heard about it in panel one already, budget. It keeps coming up, budget and money and funding. So in our research or in our work, it just seems often that our research has to provide evidence of why budget and allocation of funds is so necessary in certain areas for the change we want to see to come about. Casey and Felicia, I know a lot of what you guys have done has been advocacy work. So similarly, like where have you seen anti-racist principles or anti-racist work be really helpful to the populations that you serve? Any of you want to take it away?
Sure. So I'll go ahead and answer that question. Similar to Cecilia's response, I find conversation to be really helpful. And that includes conversations not just with organizations and elected officials, but also with community members as well, because we need to hear their perspectives on how the systems are impacting them and see where that can influence policy and response, practices. So I think that's one really useful tool. And I think particularly at Black Women's Blueprint, where I've been interning, one thing that they've been focusing on over the past year is a community talkback series that has these conversations and brings up conversations like racism, gender equity, and maternal mortality in healthcare specifically. So I think those tools and those conversations are really important to have.
Can you share a little bit more about what Blueprint does?
Yeah, so they are a Black human rights feminist organization, and they do a lot of work around providing resources for sexual assault survivors. They actually were one of the first organizations to ever host a Truth and Reconciliation Commission around sexual assault and trauma throughout the Black community within the United States. So they are really groundbreaking in that regard. They provide all different kinds of resources to their member participants as well.
Okay, thank you again.
I'm smiling for many reasons. One, it's curious to me that anti-racist conversations are being had in communities of color. We are clear in communities of color that racism is systemic and how it impacts us and our communities. I think what's important is that we start to have those conversations in other communities that are not predominantly communities of color and at larger tables. So when I have an opportunity and I am, at the table with a city, state, or federal agency, that is where I begin to have those conversations where they seem to be less clear about how racist policies are impacting people of color. So, I am not a proponent of re-traumatizing a community by continuing to have conversations in a community about racism. I mean, we get it, we know it's here, and let's start having those conversations where they really matter is why I was smiling.
Yeah, Felicia, before you don't mute yet. I know you're very much about a collaborative and an integrative approach, especially in the work you do and the population you serve. Could you share a little bit more about like how you yourself have been very much about the need for collaboration and an interdisciplinary approach with communities of color?
Absolutely. A recent example of the need to collaborate was an event that was law-based, legal-based. It was the RICO Act that was enforced in our community 125 men were sucked out of the community on one day. That meant that mothers lost their sons, children lost their fathers, siblings lost their brothers. And so now that some of these individuals are coming back home, we need to look at restorative justice. We need to start looking at integrative ways to help them come home and welcome them home. And that is not something that I can do alone, right? That is something that takes a community-based approach. And so as a community organizer, what I do is I seek to partner with other organizations, agencies. I talk to parents, I talk to the individuals impacted themselves to understand what are the needs and then how do we begin to address them. So one of the things that I heard was that there were some elders in the community that were a bit concerned with these gentlemen coming back home. So what I did was I brought together holistic practitioners. I brought together counselors that specialize in working with the aging community to understand their concerns and to see what we can do to kind of address them. But I also brought in vocational trainers. Often we have young men in our community that are going into the justice system that are not receiving any kind of vocational training or rehabilitative training while they are in the inside. So specifically for them, we brought in OSHA trainers. We brought in other financial planners, workforce development companies that try to help them integrate back into a society with dignity. You did your time, welcome home, and what can we do to help you along the way?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of integrative stuff that I think is important that we begin to look at.
Beautiful. And then also, I know we've had discussion about law enforcement, and that panel one touched a little bit about that as well. In terms of your collaborative approach, how have you found law enforcement to be supportive for the work that you're doing?
So I just want to start by saying my work is predominantly in Harlem, although our not-for-profit was the first in the borough of Manhattan to be funded by the state of New York to do the work that we do. And so I have 12 sectors at the table with me to help me do the work. Law enforcement is an integral part of what we do. So on the youth side, we created a basketball tournament and it involved NYPD and our young people. But the basketball games were just the vehicle to bring them together to start to have conversations. I want my community officers, my community affairs officers, my NCOs to know my young people when they see them in the streets. And I want my young people to know their local NCOs. And so it was really a way to create a bridge in conversations. We have worked with NYPD and gone to a women's shelter and handed out toys. We have fed the community in partnership with NYPD. We're working very closely with NYPD right now to help facilitate what is called CREW, which is a community response to opioid overdose. So they are very important resources for me to be able to do some of the work that I do in this community.
Good stuff. Thank you for sharing that. We're transitioning to that point where we hear about integration and approaches and why educational institutions like Fordham are so important to this work. Celia, I know in some of your research, you had a journal article recently as well that may be a really great intervention or tool that could be used. Could you share more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I am a staff member of the Fordham Urban Law Journal. And when I was looking for research projects for my note, I was really struck by all the conversations that were happening last year about the possibility of police reform. And one of the areas that has really been a flashpoint is whether social workers should be involved in law enforcement response. And as part of my research, I looked into the history of what has been done and what is being done now. And what I've found is there seem to be a few ways that social workers have historically or are involved now in the police force, in law enforcement response to 911 calls in particular. And there are social workers who work on the police force, as we saw in our first panel today. There are also social workers who may not be employed by police departments, but who do work in partnership, particularly on mental health calls to 911. They may not be directly routed by 911. They may be called for backup once the scene has been identified as being related to a mental health crisis. And then there's a third option, which ultimately I found the most compelling, which was to have social workers as well as paramedics act as community responders. So the calls can still go to 911, but there will be no law enforcement present at the scene when they respond to somebody who is having a mental health or possibly even a physical health crisis, because if somebody is out in public, there are certain health conditions that might manifest and appear to bystanders as a mental health crisis, even if they are not. So I think that having those interdisciplinary teams and having them have some reputational separation can be really beneficial to communities that have had negative experiences with uniformed officers. But overall, what I found both in my research and my experience in the dual degree is that there is a lot of space for interdisciplinary work. Every internship I've had has had interdisciplinary teams of investigators, of social workers, of attorneys. And I find it a little strange in conceptualizing my experience that we're expected to go out and have these interdisciplinary teams and have these conversations, but none of our skill sets exists in a vacuum. And I think that having some more collaboration in training would be beneficial to everyone in the advocacy professions as well.
Nice. Thank you so much. Any reactions, Carlos, Casey, anything you want to add to either comments?
I would add to the piece about the interdisciplinary approach. In most of my roles as a social worker, I've worked as part of interdisciplinary teams, and I couldn't agree more. Right? I think the one thing that I would advocate for, and for those who are considering careers in social work, is to place a higher value in the social work contribution, right? Where very often you find that depending on who's sitting on that interdisciplinary team, sometimes there are disciplines that weigh a little heavier. And, sometimes as social workers, we take a back seat. So I would say that, we need to sort of push the agenda and put a little bit more value into our contribution. Because I do agree that, the interdisciplinary approach is important, but I do feel that we need to put more weight. And as the previous panel sort of mentioned, I think that's something that we need to sort of take on ourselves, right? We can't expect, the others to sort of just do it for us. So we got to take on that challenge.
That was a really great point. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there any recommendations or suggestions that you currently have around cohesive approaches to supporting the Black and Brown communities or youth that you've worked with? Maybe some of your research thoughts, ideas so far?
A lot of my research focuses on Latino populations. A lot of the work that I've been doing on the clinical side has been sort of working within that group, and in that group that we're underrepresented. So this idea that I have to sort of take on the challenge to bring those ideas forward and make it a priority. Help individuals around that table understand what we're actually dealing with. That becomes part of the challenge that I face. And I think in terms of trying to push the agenda, as Felicia mentioned earlier, right? Being in these groups where there are the powers that be, I think that we need to be present at that table and just to bring our narrative, and help people to understand and prioritize, right?
Thank you. Any other thoughts before we start to wind down? We have about 10 more minutes. So we're gonna have some final thoughts. Okay, so anyone that's tuning in, you can also feel free. We're gonna have a question and answer period in a few moments. You can start to put your questions as well in the question and answer section. So one of the last questions for all of you, what recommendation, you are students, that you would give to educational institutions to better prepare students around working in the field, either with an anti-racist lens and or supporting organizations they go into around establishing, creating anti-racist principles? I know that's a lot to take on, but just what can schools do? What can educational environments do? Because you're all in one. Like, what is it that can be a first step? That's Casey, I'm gonna put you on the spot as first one up.
Yeah, so I think the thing that kind of jumped to mind when I heard that question immediately was improving curriculum, which is always a huge task for any school. And I know that, there's a lot of controversy around that, but I think that it's really important that when we're looking at curriculum and syllabi, institutions are choosing reading materials that are reflective of what's currently happening and not 20 years ago of what was happening, including authors who represent a diverse background in terms of being educated at Harvard versus being educated at more local universities, because I think what we really want to touch on is just that there are all these different ideas and all these different resources that get missed when we keep pulling from the same places that clearly haven't been getting to the point that we want to be at in terms of building an anti-racist curriculum or institution.
Thank you. Curriculum, that's the first step. Anyone else want to jump in?
I will. I think there are a couple of things that institutions can do. And so in addition to curriculum, and I think the curriculum is a great way to address that, but I also think that it's important for professors to address their own internal biases that bubble out often when working with trying to understand the positions of students of color. And so I'll put that there. The second thing that I think is important is institutions can truly partner with organizations that are rooted in the communities in order to give a broader breadth and scope to budding social workers. And so those are two that come to the top of mind, but I agree with Casey that curriculum needs to certainly be a part of that conversation.
Thank you. And I think like the GSS Action Committee, part of their work is thinking about how there can be more training for professors around doing some of this work. And also how we as students or potential and budding social work students can also be integrated into the field in a different way or an approach that is more representative of what they will experience when they do go out in the field. Great.
I would add to the discussion that institutions can make it a priority to pursue and recruit staff that is reflective of the communities they want to work with. That sort of leads me to the discussion around mentoring, which, I know for me has been a key factor. Being part of an underrepresented population, I know for me it's been critical to have people on faculty who I can not only identify with, but can also confide in terms of trying to navigate an environment that, is difficult as a male of color, first generation immigrant. So I think that, those two things. And in addition, I would say create spaces where students of color can sort of find support in each other. In terms of, going through a journey that can be challenging in ways that are unique, right, to a population of color. So I think that those things, as a student thinking of the institutions that you know, I have gathered my education from, that those are the things that I would add to the conversation so far. I mean, I think the other points are great as well, but I would add those to the discussion.
Thank you. Great points. Celia, wrap us up.
I would definitely agree with all of the suggestions from my co-panelists. I think curriculum is very important. I think recruiting staff is very important. And I can actually give an example of something that I thought was very helpful from the Fordham Law School. When we first started, we had a week-long orientation, and there was actually time set aside to review internal bias and have a discussion about that. And I thought that that was a really powerful opportunity to start those conversations early on in the graduate program. And I think that having that open dialogue and encouraging people to confront their own biases and to be able to discuss them and work through them is a really powerful opportunity as well.
Thank you so much. The funny thing is that a lot of even like the work, because I do a lot of work with child welfare, a lot of the work within elementary and high schools are around how educators, right, can also be more culturally aware, can address their own biases. And now the challenge is transitioning that awareness among educators at the elementary and the high school level to having that be educators at the tertiary level as well, to make sure that society at large is getting the love and the support it needs. So thank you guys so much. So insightful, and hoping to do more work together. I am going to pass the torch over to Professor Isam to spearhead our question and answer period.
So we have been getting, thank you so much, panel. And if everybody actually who's on the first panel, professors, everybody can put their cameras on, because we have about 15 minutes left. I have been seeing not questions in the chat, but already people saying, can we do this again? Can we have a session 2? It was so fabulous. People like the first conversation was really good. We wish we had more time to hear from them. The suggestions that the students had were fantastic also. And so I'm looking, because I know that Samina and Elaine are supposed to let me know whether or not there are questions, but there doesn't look like there are any questions. So this is what I'm going to call an audible, and this is what I'm going to do. What is it that you did not get the chance to say today that you really wanted to make sure that you got across to the audience? I know I often have stuff in my head that I'm like, I'm going to say these 3 things no matter what happens. So is there anything that anybody wanted to say that they didn't get to say? I am also not opposed to ending 15 minutes earlier so that we can do that also. Anything that anybody wanted to say that we didn't ask you?
I do. Hi.
I knew, wait a minute, how did I know you did, Alicia? I knew, I was looking at you. And I said, she's very quiet on this panel. So she's either behaving herself or something's going on. Okay, go ahead.
You know me so well.
I
know. Thank you. And you know, this has just been great. One of the things that I heard in Dean McPhee's intro was, you know, promoting power among the citizens. And so for me, it is key. I was listening to Carlos, and you know, he was saying how, you know, social workers really don't get the accolades and the respect that we deserve. And so I am of the position not to ask. I don't ask for permission for the power. It is every chance I get, I use my position to promote power, not only for myself, my organization, but for my community. And so I don't sit back and I don't ask for permission. It is, how do I use a platform that I am on to promote what is presented as a need, and then to figure out who at the table can help me solve that problem. And so I just, you know, I'm not one to sit back and ask and wait for someone to recognize. It is, how do we know who's at the table, and to have them step up too to help promote that power.
I'm gonna mess it up. I have an Audre Lorde comment that says something like, you know, we have to speak up even when we're afraid, because our silence doesn't protect us. And I appreciate what you said earlier about not re-traumatizing marginalized populations, but there is, I want to acknowledge there is something traumatic about being in these conversations and being afraid and having those butterflies in your stomach and wanting to step up. I heard Carlos very eloquently say, having mentors, having people who he can trust as a first generation person is being so important to be available to you, because this stuff can be scary, right? When you're speaking up. And yesterday I heard an expression that said, the woman said that she's gonna say parent power instead of parent engagement, because parents already have their power. We're the ones that act like we gotta empower people and we gotta allow people to be at the table. And what would happen is if we really kind of just used our power in that, the way you said, and not ask for permission. So thank you so much for sharing that. Anybody else, anything else you want to share that you wish you, okay, go ahead, Derek.
And just two quick things. One, just going back to the whole policing and what social workers' role may be. I often think around, as social workers, we learn, like if you're working with, say, that mom who did something terrible to their child or neglected their child, and they're assigned to your case. We go into that discussion with the ultimate goal of family reunification, even though we know that that mom may have made some bad choices at one time. And I use that analogy and relate it to policing and say that in policing, we know historically all the stuff we talked about, we know what we've seen and some of the bad things, but social workers' role is to bring folks together, not to only keep people apart. And in that case of that neglecting mother, if you as a social worker had some own personal bias toward that, what would you do? You'd refer to somebody else, or you'd figure out a way so that your personal beliefs and values don't influence what is best for that family. And I guess I would say this as we think about these large community systems changes as well. As social workers, the inherent internal bias that we may have towards a particular system, we sometimes need to check that, because if it is not us as social workers helping our community and our criminal justice agencies speak together, who else is going to do it? When I worked at Ozone House with those young people, we had these policies to keep police out of our agency. I understood why. But now when I look back, every night that I went home and went to sleep and I was safe in my bed, the kids from our organization who were out on the streets, and a lot of them had interaction with police, and those police officers, because we didn't help facilitate the officers to know them and the kids to know the officers. Right. I now look back and say we missed an opportunity, right? Yep. So I wanted to say that. And then the last one is, be mindful when you say you speak for communities, right? I have seen a lot of people who are well-intentioned and want to help. But if I'm taking my own personal values from my safe community that isn't over-policed, and I am putting that on and saying, like, that's what you want in your community, sometimes we're a little off, even if in our hearts we're trying to do the right thing. So those are the last two things that I had on my list that I wanted to say earlier.
Really good point. Anybody else final words?
I wanted to say something. First, that was terrific. I mean, wonderful, wonderful speaker. But I just want to say something in terms of academia. I mean, one thing, and I think we have to revisit this in terms of teaching. You have to understand yourself and what may be your internal biases. And I think this is a part of kind of putting a kind of an anti-racist perspective in terms of courses, in terms of curriculum. We have to begin there. And I mean, I really think that we should look at this in terms of the way when people come into social work school. And we also really want to make sure that everyone can come to school. And there was a question posed about, like, how do you pay for it? And this is a real issue. I mean, when poor people who might want to go on to school, just aren't able to. And so I think we need more scholarships and more funds for people to be able to go to social work school and law school, or whatever type of education that they seek. And so this is something we need to work on.
Thank you, Dr. Congress. One question and then a wrap up. How are anti-racist principles being implemented in policies related to child welfare, law enforcement systems. Have anybody seen any models where those principles are actually actively being applied?
So I know Jennifer had to jump off, but as soon as she said what she said around the work that she's doing now with City Council and looking at their policies, I went and started looking it up. So you can Google her and find some of the work that she's doing. I think honestly, the whole time she was talking, I'm like, oh yeah, let me write this down. So I think that's one example.
That is one, but that's very new. So maybe the answer to this question is that it's not really happening in the way that we would want it to happen, and that the importance of this panel was to talk about the fact that we need to right now start finding in all of these systems ways to really make sure that we understand, first of all, what anti-racist principles are, what they look like on the ground, and that then we are making sure, especially if we are in academia and we are instructors and teachers, making sure that we are teaching that. I think somebody said, I think it was Celia, said that it's so funny that we talk about interdisciplinary education, but we don't spend enough time with their skills working in collaboration. So to me, I know that one of the principles of anti-racist principles is centering the people who are at the work and making sure that we are working more collaboratively, not just this one idea like my one research paper and this one kind of academic thing that I wanted to do, that it's gotta be more, we've gotta break out of those shells. I am going to I'm going to thank all of the panelists again. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Binta Allen Green, and then I'm going to say a final word, and we will be on to the rest of our day and the work that we're doing. Thank you again, panelists. Binta?
Thank you so much. My heart feels so full right now. Both panels were just absolutely amazing. And the panels with the students, I really want to thank you all for just such a powerful discussion. And Felicia, I've known you for the last, 5 years or so. Felicia was one of my students. And the work that you're doing, every time I see your name, I feel so proud, right? I feel so incredibly proud. And I think that you really, all of you on the student panel touched on the need for us as instructors and faculty to really step up and do this work to make sure that we are preparing students to go out into the world and practice from a human rights, anti-racist lens, right? But before we can do that and teach you that, we ourselves need to learn that. We ourselves need to do the work. And I think, the Action Committee is so committed to ensuring that here at GSS, we are working with faculty, the administration, and everyone to start that training for faculty, to start understanding their own biases, our own biases, right? And Carlos, I know you mentioned the need to see more people that look like you. The truth of the matter is, here at GSS, almost 70% of our student body are students of color. Yet our faculty of color it's so small, right? I know full-time faculty, we have maybe 4 or 5 people that are people of color. And so that again shows the need for our students to see people like us in the classrooms, leading discussions, teaching from an anti-racist perspective, and so they can go into the field and practice. And so we are committed here at GSS, and I know the dean is as well, to ensuring that we train and not only our students, but our faculty to really represent this work. And it as you were talking about models for anti-racist practice, I was like, the first thing that I believe before we can talk about models is to understand that we need to know, everyone needs to be on the same page about what anti-racist perspective and anti-racist lens and anti-racist, to be anti-racist. Everyone first needs to know what that even means. And that's where that training comes in, right? And so again, I just want to thank everyone for this amazing, amazing opportunity to start this conversation. And we are really fired up to continue the conversation. And I look forward to working with all of you in the future. So Ed, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Sister Benta, and being one of those, tenured, beautiful women of color. I appreciate your leadership, and I appreciate you being here as I join the Fordham family, and really look forward to getting into some trouble with you also. So hopefully people are ready for that. I want to say to the 100 people that are still on here with us, I know, right? I end this conversation where I started with, that it is a difficult time in our country. I know that you all have given us 2 hours of your time, and the kids could be in the background. You have other things. You're going to be on Zoom all day long. We are in the midst of this pandemic. We're seeing some hope, but we're still exhausted, like literally exhausted. Our minds, our bodies, all of us. And so I want to call you at this moment to remember to take care of yourself. I know that y'all are looking at me like, Ann, when is that supposed to happen? But if you don't take care of yourself, there will not be any joyful warriors to do this work. We need to be on high alert because there's always something happening, but we need to take care of ourselves. We need to dig deeper and find other solutions, and we need to rest. We need to be resilient, but being resilient doesn't mean that we're giving people permission to keep on beating us up, right? And we need to have this radical imagination, because I promise you, it does not exist, Binta. Whatever we're talking about, wherever we want to get to, does not exist. So if someone tells you that they have the answer, I'm not sure that that is true, because it's not out there. We've got to use a radical imagination to see a world that does not yet exist. And while we have to be collective and culturally appropriate in what we do, we must start with our person, our personal healing, our personal work, our personal self, because self is the best instrument that we have. So with all of the pain around us, with all that you're doing, I want to call you to take care of yourself so that we together can continue to be the social justice warriors that we want to continue to decrease and to call for a decrease in oppression and the racism and all the other isms that we actually probably didn't do a good job talking about today that exist here in America. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and working with all of you in the future. Thank you so much.